Thank you very much, Paul, and good afternoon to everybody who's in Europe or Africa, and good evening if you're in Asia, good morning if you're in the Americas, if you're in Australasia or Oceania. Wow, I'm impressed you're here at this time of night. It's wonderful that you've all come to join this session. This is the second of two webinars, and a couple of weeks ago I did a webinar about online storytelling, and today we're talking about face-to-face storytelling, and particularly what we can do when we are back in this face-to-face space, which some of us are moving towards, some of us are already in, depending on what stage you are regarding the pandemic and the restrictions. So I'm David Heathfield and I'm a storyteller, and let's just find the PowerPoint. There we go. So face-to-face storytelling. Freedom to share physical and sensory space. And that is me in the photograph in a multicultural storytelling event. How can we make the most of the space we physically share with our students? And we're going to look at these things. Adapting the physical space we share, bringing sensory features such as touch, smell, taste, movement into storytelling, as well as sound and vision. So sound and vision we can easily do online, but these other things, these more other senses that are difficult to communicate, more challenging to communicate if we're online. Getting our students moving freely and talking freely. So disinhibiting students so they speak, communicate, listen to each other. Giving learners opportunities to be inventive, to rehearse, to perform as they learn creatively together within a supportive confidence building framework. And that's our duty, to make it supportive and to give them confidence so that they feel safe about playing and exploring. So that's what today's session is all about. Does that sound all right? So in the last webinar, the online one, we looked at various techniques for online storytelling, but if you haven't watched it already, I would recommend going back and watching it after today, because really the techniques are not only to be used online, but also face-to-face, what we looked at last time. But today we're specifically looking at what we can do face-to-face. In the last webinar, I told you a story from Myanmar and a story from Japan. Today, we're going to have a story from Angola and a story from Northern Europe. So we're travelling the world with stories. So let me just click on, and here's a birch forest, because there's a tree theme emerging today, and I love trees. So that's the background that I've chosen for my PowerPoint. And we're looking at how we breathe as one when we're in a natural space, when we're sharing stories, whether it's outside in the forest or also in the classroom. It's different from online because we're together, we're sharing the space. It's a communal experience, storytelling. We're around the storyteller, whether that's the teacher or the students. And this is a photograph of Enadina Sana, who recently did some courses with me, who's a Sardinian storyteller, and has written a book which is soon to be published. And in translation from one of her passages in her book, Enadina writes, "The magic of storytelling exists and is powerful. You have to put this ritual into practice and experience for yourself how true this is." So if you're new to storytelling, maybe you haven't already found out how powerful it can be. But if you're storytelling teachers, or you've been lucky enough to have had a storytelling teacher or a storytelling teacher trainer, you know how powerful storytelling can be. There's an energy that springs from the encounter between the voice that narrates, the ears that listen, which no longer depends on individuals, but on the circle that individuals form around the narrator. It's a magic that heals, strengthens, makes you forget, makes you fall asleep, but in a good way. We need a new generation of storytellers, and I'm hoping that through today's session we'll think about how we can develop as storytellers, as storytelling teachers, and how we can develop and encourage and support our students as they grow. We can nurture them as storytellers. So that's what we're doing. And I just want to emphasize that when we're talking about storytelling in this context of this session, we're talking about face-to-face storytelling. And we're talking about stories that we've learned in our minds and in our hearts. So stories that we can tell without reference to a written text. So it's a story that we've learned, or a story that we know that we're sharing. Typically, folk tales, mythology and legends. I wrote a book a few years ago, Storytelling with Our Students, which has 40 stories from all around the world, many of which I learned from students that I've taught. And it's all about developing as a classroom storyteller and developing your students. So today we're going to look at 4 particular aspects. We're going to look at physical storytelling, multisensory storytelling. We're going to look at rhythmic chants. We're going to look at percussion, so that's very rhythmic. And we're looking at what we can do in the classroom, but also what we can do beyond the classroom, outside the classroom, but together in a physical space. So last time I showed you this photograph of collage of photos of people I've learned stories from, and I'll just mention some of these people again. Working from the right, you've got Lumana Tamraca in Nepal, then Francisco Perez in Guatemala, who taught me the story of the rabbit in the moon, and then at the top is Iman Al-Hasha from Libya, and below her Emel Yelchen from Turkey, and the bottom left is Natakan Charansek, who told me the story of the turtle and the snake from Thailand. But today we're going to begin with a story that I learned from a student and a friend, Constantino Salomao, the man at the top left. And Constantino comes from Angola, and he's living now, studying in my city, in Exeter, in the southwest of England here. That's where I am. That's where Constantino is. Constantino comes from here, from Angola. And it was a few years ago, before he started his PhD, that Constantino told me this story. And it was an intercultural exchange of language learners doing an English course at the University of Exeter. And Constantino got down on his haunches and started to do a dance as he told this story from his home culture. He's Umbundu. He speaks Umbundu language, and he lives in, he comes from Angola, and he grew up in a small community. And he said that he as a child, they would do the frog dance as they told this story. The story's very short, but if you know African storytelling, with the dance and with all the joining in, it probably went on much longer. But I'm going to tell you the short version that I learned from Constantino. And we're going to look at physical storytelling. So he taught me that when we begin a story, the storyteller says, Olupolo, Olupolo. And the people listening respond by saying, Wiye. And Olupolo means story time, and Wiye means we're with you in the story. So it's a call and response. So that means you're joining me in the story. So we're going to learn the story together, and it's physical storytelling. Now, we're going to do it online, but as you will see, and you can imagine, it's so much more community when we're doing it together. If we move the classroom furniture aside and we share the space, we're all breathing the same air. We're in a circle or a bunch. Maybe we've even stepped out of the classroom into the garden or the outdoor courtyard of the school, and we're going to really physically tell this story together. So imagine we're all together, and you're going to learn the story. The first time you're going to mime with me, so I don't need to hear you, which you can't do anyway, but please join in with all the actions. So please stand up with me if you're comfortable to do that. computer up here. Come out of the share. Okay. Okay. It's about a frog. Olupolo. 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 Once there was a frog. Yes, do it with me. Who wanted to fly. I want to fly. I want to fly. I want to fly. 2 birds flew down. Hold this stick in your mouth and we will help you fly. Don't open your mouth. The frog put the stick in his mouth. The 2 birds took the ends of the stick in their beaks and the 2 birds flew up into the sky. The frog was flying. The frog looked down at the world below. It was wonderful. I'm flying. I'm a flying frog, thought the frog. The frog could see the trees and all of the animals. Up in the tree, the monkey said, "The frog is flying! The frog is flying!" Under the tree, the lion said, "Frogs don't fly." Up in the tree, the monkey said, "Yeah, the frog is flying! The frog is flying!" Under the tree, the giraffe said, "Frogs don't fly." Up in the tree, the monkey said, "The frog is flying! The frog is flying! The frog is flying!" Under the tree, the elephant said, "Frogs don't fly." Up in the tree, the monkey said, "The frog is flying! The frog is flying!" Up in the sky, the frog could hear everything. The frog wanted all of the animals to know that he was a flying frog. "I'm the flying frog!" That was the end of the frog. And this is the end of the story. Now, thank you. Thank you for miming the story with me. And whether you're a child or a teenager or an adult, all of us were in the story together. Now, the second, maybe you were even joining in with some of the words, weren't you? So the first time we tell that story, we're all in it together. But the second time we tell the story, we're going to do mirroring. So I will do a bit, a chunk, and then you will do a chunk. And I'd like you to mirror me. So you can do the same actions, the same mimes, the same voice, the same words, the same accent, the same everything, the same energy. So me, then you. Okay? Me, then you. We're just going to do the first part of the story. Let's try it. Olupolo, wiye. There was a frog who wanted to fly. I want to fly, I want to fly, I want to fly. Two birds flew down. They held a stick. Put the stick in your mouth, frog. Don't open your mouth and we'll help you fly. birds took the ends of the stick in their mouths, in their beaks, and they flew up into the air. The frogs thought, I can see everything. I can see the trees. I can see the animals. Up in the tree, the monkey said, the frog is flying! The frog is flying! Under the tree, the lion said, frogs don't fly. Brilliant. Don't sit down. We're going to continue. But we go through the whole story like this, call and response. That's one way. But then the third time we tell the story, we'll tell it together. So let's continue the story, and you and I, we're telling the story together. Of course, this might be easier when we're together in the same room. Okay, ready? We'll go from the monkey in the tree and then the lion. Ready? Together. Up in the tree, the monkey said, the frog is flying! The frog is flying! Under the tree, the lion said, frogs don't fly. Up in the tree, the monkey said, the frog is flying! The frog is flying! Under the tree, the giraffe said, frogs don't fly. Up in the tree, the monkey said, the frog is flying! The frog is flying! Under the tree, the elephant said, frogs don't fly. Up in the tree, the monkey said, the frog's flying! The frog's flying! The frog is flying! Up in the sky, the frog thought, I want all of the animals to know that I'm flying. And the frog said, I am the flying frog! That was the end of the frog, and this is the end of the story. Thank you. Now you were doing that with me, together. Maybe you were doing it exactly the same time as me, or maybe just a split second after me, like you were shadowing me. I'm going to sit down now. So, when we're doing that, whether we're children, young children, older children, adults, how are we learning English? What kind of English are we learning? Or is there anything that we're not learning? I maybe should ask. But what is the learning that's happening by doing storytelling in this way? Repetition, yes. Kids would love to hear amazing. What about the learning? What about the English learning that's going on? TPR, this total physical response, absolutely. Learning fluency. Okay, so the rhythm and the fluency of the language. It's amusing, it's enjoyable. Vocabulary through the repetition. Critical thinking. We might be talking about, what happens if we don't listen to the advice. The bird said, don't let go, don't open your mouth. But the frog just couldn't help everyone to know. Expression, intonation, structures. The frog is flying, maybe the present continuous, grammatical structures. Visualization, they're imagining it. There's just so much going on. Intonation of language. Thank you, Svetlana. So much is happening. So much learning. So let's go back. Let's go back to the PowerPoint. There's my friend Constantino. Oh, there's another photo. Just a couple of weeks ago, we went for a walk by the river. So immediately after the story, with children, for example, we might ask them to imagine, you know, what's going on in the story. Here they are all being the elephant in the story at that moment, acting it out. But this isn't only for young children. I've done this activity with adult women from Japan and Korea, just to really disinhibit and start to play with the language and the pronunciation. So for physical storytelling, this is a process, one possible process that we might follow. So we create a space first, maybe moving desks aside. If the desks in our classroom can't be moved, is there another space we can use, a communal space or an outdoor space? If we're in a classroom where we cannot move the tables and cannot move the desks, or the students are not allowed to be close to each other because of the virus, then we can ask them to put their chairs under the table and, you know, imagine we're in a bunch together, but changing somehow the dynamic of the room, of the space. And the first telling, with a smile, with a gesture, invite students to mime the story with you, and maybe even start to join in the repeated phrases. The frog is flying. Second telling, students are mirroring you, repeating the same postures, mimes, facial expressions, feelings, voices, language. And don't flag, keep up the momentum, keep up the energy. You know, don't wait for the slowest one, keep up the energy of the story. And then the third telling, and we did this, we split it in two, didn't we? The third telling asks students to tell the story together with you. Some will be with you, some will be shadowing you some of the time. In other words, they're just a second behind you, but they're with you, they're shadowing. The fourth telling asks students to face each other in pairs and retell mirroring their partner. Remind them to keep their mimes and voices strong. Support pairs who are struggling by joining in. So if one pair of students, you know, doesn't remember what comes next, tell them to put their hand up. And if you've got another adult with you, you can both be floating and going to those students where they need a prompt to get to the next part. We might put pairs where there's a more confident storytelling student with a less confident storytelling student, so they can support each other. When they're facing each other, you might still be doing it chorally, or you might take them into a bigger space like a garden, and they're splitting off and they're all telling it at their own pace. 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th telling. Encourage students to tell the story, or even teach it to different people they know. Take it home. Tell your mum, tell your dad, tell your brothers and sisters, tell your neighbours. You know, play with the story. Maybe make a recording of the story. Share it on the class platform, the Padlet, for example. And then next class, remember, we're going to start by telling the story, so make sure you remember it. So start the next lesson by getting students into a standing circle to retell the story in unison. So it's this repetition of storytelling which is so powerful, finding many different ways to tell it. And that can be an early on in the language learning process, not only with children, but we're often thinking about children when we're doing physical storytelling. And always allow this moment of reflection. Students share their strategies for remembering the story and how these can help them on their language learning journey. So you might find that some children are remembering the teacher's posture and actions when you were telling. Others are remembering your voice. Others are making mental pictures. They're seeing the story. They'll find their own strategies, and you can get them to talk about that. Okay. So here are some adults learning a story in this way. In fact, they're taking it another step. They're stepping through the story. They're linking arms and they're telling the story, and then stepping each time they move to the next animal. So they're moving to the frog. They're moving now to the lion. Then they tell the next part of the story. Then they take a step and they become the giraffe. And then they take another step and they become the elephant. So that's another way of remembering a story and learning a story. Very physical storytelling approaches, the energy in a group, in a class. So back into the forest. Now, this morning I went to one of my favourite places. I went to Bystock Heath, which is a nature reserve. It's part of Woodbury Common near my home in Exeter. And I went there. I was drawn to go there for a walk with my wife because I often go there in the summer, not this last summer because of the pandemic. And I do storytelling as part of an annual festival. And I tell stories set in nature. And there's a beautiful birch tree. And this morning I went to the birch tree, and you can see it's just late winter, early spring here. And you can see here I picked some buds. You can see the leaf buds are just appearing on the birch tree now. And there's a birch tree there where I always tell the next story. So you could tell this story in a classroom, but equally you might tell this story under a tree, maybe near the school. This is a photograph by a photographer called Andreas Raven Muller, and I look at that birch tree, the golden leaves. It's not spring in this photograph because this story takes place at the end of the year, in the autumn. So everybody, I'm going to tell you the story. I just saw a question, are you going to get the stories as well? Well, the first story I just told you, I actually published it in this magazine, English Teaching Professional, so you could always get it from here. And look, there's a lovely illustration of the flying frog. And there's a picture of Constantino. But the next story I tell, and you can listen to me telling it on YouTube. All of my stories are on YouTube. But the next story I'm going to tell will be in an article that I'm going to write for the British Council Teaching English, which will be coming out soon. And so you'll be able to get the story then. So back to the story. The birch tree. It's a European story, a Northern European story. And I'm going to encourage you again to join in with the story. Even if I can't hear you, you can be contributing to the story. And afterwards I'm going to ask you to choose a moment from the story. Choose one moment from the story. Okay. I think I'll sit down for this one. I think so. So we're looking at sensory storytelling and storytelling in different spaces where we share the space. In the story, there's some wool. Sheep's wool. Can you feel it? Can you imagine feeling it? In the story, there's a sheep bell as well. And the tree, the birch tree, one of my favourite trees. That's where I went to today. I told the story to my wife under the tree in preparation for this afternoon because it's a good idea to rehearse stories. Let's begin. Once upon a time, there was a shepherd girl, and her job, this poor girl, was to look after her sheep, her flock of sheep. At the end of the day, she was tired. Time to go home. And she counted her sheep. But there was one sheep missing. Oh. She left the flock where they were and she went looking for the lost sheep. Sheep, sheep, where are you, sheep? Let's say it together. Sheep, sheep, where are you, sheep? And in the distance she could hear the bell. So she went in that direction and she saw a piece of wool caught on a twig. So she took the wool. She thought, my sheep has gone this way. And she twisted the wool round her finger. And she called again. Sheep, sheep, where are you, sheep? Sheep, sheep, where are you, sheep? Again in the distance she heard the bell. And she walked towards the forest. Has my sheep gone in the forest? It was getting dark now, but still she went looking for her sheep. Sheep, sheep, where are you, sheep? She found more wool and twisted it round her finger. Deeper into the forest. But now it was dark and she was lost, and her sheep was lost. She sat down under a tree, a birch tree, and began to cry. Why are you so sad? She looked up, and there above her she could see the eyes and the face of the birch tree spirit looking down at her. Oh, I have lost my sheep. I must find my sheep. But now I am lost. Please help me. I will help you, said the tree, if you will show me how to dance. Will you show me? You have feet and legs. I have roots deep in the ground. Please teach me how to dance. So the shepherd girl thought, I will. And she picked up the corners of her apron and she danced. One step to the left, one step to the right, back to the left, and back to the right. She danced around the tree. And as she danced around the tree reached down with its branches and caught hold of her arms and her hands. And she was turning round the tree, dancing prettily, and the tree pulled her roots out of the earth. And the tree and the girl and the girl and the tree danced round and round and round, faster and faster and faster, and the girl was carried up into the sky, dancing round and round the tree, and oh, it was so beautiful but so tiring, and she was so tired, and she said, sleep, sleep, I need to sleep. But the tree danced her faster and faster, and she cried again, sleep, sleep, I need to sleep. Oh, please, it's too fast. Sleep, sleep, I need to sleep. And the tree let go, and the girl flew high into the sky. Among the stars she flew, and then down, 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 but the tree caught her in the branches, and the tree rocked her in the breeze, and the shepherd girl slept. In the morning, when the girl woke up, the morning sun had risen. Put me down. And the tree set the girl down on a pile of golden leaves that had fallen during the dance. And the girl stood up, and the tree said, now I know what dancing is. Thank you. Where is my sheep? Said the girl. See, see, just look and see. And there, beside the tree, was her sheep. So she took the sheep, and she was going to leave, and the tree spirit spoke again. See, see, Just look and see. And she looked, and there in the branches of the tree was the wool that she had gathered. But the wool had been spun in the dance into a fine skein. Thank you. And she took the wool that had been spun. But the tree said again, see, see, just look and see. And she looked at the leaves that had fallen in the dance, and they seemed so beautiful, golden. So she picked up some leaves and she put them in her apron, and she walked with the sheep, saying goodbye to the tree and out of the forest, and she wasn't lost. She could easily find her way out. And she found the rest of the sheep. And together she said to her sheep, let us go home, I'm tired. And they walked until they came to the road, the hard road. But her apron now was so heavy. She had to let go. And when she let go, all of the coins fell on the ground. The leaves, the golden leaves, had become golden coins. The poor shepherd girl had gold. All because she taught the birch tree how to dance. Thank you very much. That's the story of the birch tree. Yes, I've told it to you. Now you can take it and remember it and tell it to others. If you want to remember it, there'll be a recording of this webinar, but also there are recordings already of me telling it on YouTube. So, I asked you to choose one moment from that story. I'm just going to give you 1 minute to begin. I'm going to sit quietly, and you can sit quietly for 1 minute, and you can choose. You can either draw a picture of the moment that you're imagining. You can draw it any way you wish. Or you could write a poem about the moment that you're imagining in the story. A poem or a piece of creative writing. Just write whatever comes into your head. So let's just sit quietly for a minute while you draw or write. And if you write, you can do it on paper, or if you want to, you can post it in the chat. You can choose. You can draw or you can write. I'm just going to check 1 minute just to begin. Okay, so like I said, it's just starting a picture or a poem. Time is limited here, but if later you decide to finish your poem or finish your picture, my email will be on the final slide, and I would be so happy if you took a photograph of your picture or wrote your poem and sent it to me, and I will always answer my emails. I would love that. You don't have to send it to me. It's up to you. Oh, here's one. I guess somebody just put a poem in the chat. I missed it. Let me see if I can get it back. Corina, the sheep dance, the sheep dance, the sheep and the girl dance, the girl and the sheep, oh far, so far, yet so near. Thank you very much. Some people talked about my storytelling skills, and yes, I'm a professional storyteller, but I have a lot of experience of working with teachers, and I know that you can be great storytellers as well. It's why we're language teachers. It just takes a little bit of practice. And sometimes people say, well, yes, David, but you're a native speaker. Well, of course, we are all models for our students, and don't have any concern about any un-Englishness you might find in the way you speak English or you might tell a story. You're a perfect model for your students for learning English. So if you're used to telling stories, go ahead and do it. But if you haven't done it before, put the books away and learn a story and tell it. It's something very special, a very special connection with the students. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about multisensory. I've done a lot of storytelling with children who have special needs or in special schools, all different kinds of complex needs, and often use sensory storytelling, and have also then brought ideas from working in that sphere into teaching English, because again, when we're learning English, all of those senses become extra important, extra valuable to help us, to support us with the language learning. So let's talk about sensory storytelling. Yeah, so the silver birch tree with the golden autumn leaves. There's the birch forest. So when we talk about multisensory approach to storytelling, we know that different people, different students will experience stories in different ways. Like I mentioned earlier, whether it's auditory, visual, kinesthetic, or different senses. Many describe seeing mental pictures of scenes from the story. So if you ask them to remember a story, they're seeing the pictures in the story. Many feel physically close to the action. They might even become a main character. I wonder if any of you became the girl or became the tree when I was telling the story, or maybe a bit of both. Auditory learners tune into the storyteller's voice patterns. So while you're remembering the story, you might still hear my voice in your head. And most listeners experience different moments through a combination of senses. It's not only visual or only auditory. Of course, it's a rich combination, and it might change from moment to moment or from story to story. So to enhance the story experience, you can actually add senses in the text. You can talk about the smell or the sound, but you can also you can use the actual English vocabulary. But alternatively, or as well as, you can provide stimuli for these senses through movement, like the dance, through gesture to emphasize, through voice modulation, so changing the pitch or the tempo or the volume of your voice, singing, maybe using some music or percussion, touch, so we can invite the students to feel the wool. Use of props, maybe even some kind of costume. Remember, she was holding the gold coins in an apron. Maybe we could wear an apron when we tell the story. So we can add all these things in. We can use pictures, but I would suggest avoiding showing pictures which are too detailed when we're storytelling. we know how much pictures support language learning, but if we can keep any pictures we have to use very simple, just line drawing, so your students can fill in the detail and the colours in their imagination. If you think about Steiner education, the puppets and dolls they make are without facial expression, so the child can project their own images onto that doll. We know there's a strong link between language, emotion and mental imagery, and here we're talking about mental imagery. Just to give you some other examples of sensory things we might do. I mean, if I'm telling a story like kolobok about baking a loaf of bread, you know, some of you are in the Ukraine, you know kolobok. So I might, here's it's hot, a hot loaf of bread. Oh, and the smell. Can you smell it? It's, I bet you can imagine smelling this loaf of bread and feeling the heat, and we might even pass a hot loaf of bread from student to student to add to that sensory experience if we've had a story with baking bread in it. Or if I'm telling the story of the wonderful brocade where the good son, the brave youngest son, has to swim through a sea of ice. You know, we could bring some ice in. And can you actually see there's ice there? I'll just stop the share a minute so you can see more clearly. And you might even dare students, how long, there's actual ice in this bowl, how long can you put your hand into the ice water? Can you endure it like the youngest son who swims through the sea of ice? Oh no, it's really getting uncomfortable now. That's definitely enough. But, we can play with these things after the story or even during the story. That is cold. We might work with movement of air. This is a fan. So the bird was flying and I fan the students so they can feel the beating of the great wings of the magic bird in the Island of the Sun story, for example. Move between the students, beating the wings. We might all have an instrument in our hands. This is my shaky beam, but I've got lots of these, so we can all make a rhythm together. Or it could be, the snakes are coming. The snakes are coming. If I'm telling the story of Egla from Lithuania. We can play with proximity. How close do we get to the students? We can play with voice direction. Do we sit among the students? Do we move between the students? Or we can stand behind the students so they're hearing the story from behind. All of these add different flavours to the storytelling experience. We can encourage students to take the story for a walk, go outside, maybe link arms like the ones you saw in the photograph I showed. And they can go and remember the story walking out among the trees. So let's take the story out into nature, for example. With rhythmic chants and percussion, we're adding another level of language learning here. Listeners can become co-storytellers by joining in during a story. The frog is flying, the frog is flying, the frog is flying. Or sheep, sheep, where are you, sheep? Sleep, sleep, I need to sleep. See, see, look and see. These are very simple chants, but we can have much longer chants. We could even turn the whole story into a chant. Makes it very memorable. We might accompany it with some percussion. This could be body percussion. Sleep, sleep, I need to sleep. Or it could be a percussive instrument. Sleep, sleep, I need to sleep. As the story goes on, listeners can move from repeating the chant after you to joining in the chant together, and then leading the chant without you. So the third time, the frog is flying, and they're starting to say it without you because it's natural, it's fun, and it emphasizes the way that we can be storytelling together. We can all be co-storytellers. Great. One person who's talked a lot about chants is Nick Bilborough, who I work with. Nick runs the Hands Up project in working with children and teachers in Palestine, particularly in Gaza. And he wrote a British Council book called Stories Alive, which is freely accessible. And lots of stories from the Middle Eastern regions and lots of ideas around storytelling and chants as well. And Nick wrote in Stories Alive, because chants contain strong rhyme patterns, they're highly memorable. And isn't memorability important when we're language learning? The rhythm that's built into the chant allows learners to naturally acquire the rhythms of the target language. They, chants, are easy to follow and are useful models for speech. They're heightened speech, aren't they? See, just look and see. It's rhythmic, it's not totally natural, but by learning these chants, we're getting closer to the target language music. Now, how about taking the story outside? I mean, I don't know what opportunities you have where you teach, but can we only use the classroom space? Now we're going back into classrooms. Children have been deprived of so much sensory experience when they've been locked down at home. And not just children, teenagers, adults. Can we give them opportunities to experience things in different contexts, bringing them closer to the outside, to nature? Storytelling round the campfire is an ideal image. Indoors, we can bring storytelling into lots of different indoor locations. It could be a communal space in the school, could be in the canteen. We could sit around the table in the canteen and be sharing a soup and telling a story about stone soup. We could go into a museum and tell stories about artifacts in the museum. I'm actually applying for funding for a project where I share stories with people around the world via Zoom. If you're interested, get in touch. Artifacts from the museum in my home city here in Exeter, and sharing stories about those inspired by artifacts like jugs and bowls and all sorts of items. Bringing museum artifacts alive through story. Fantastic project. We can do that in English. Historic buildings. Tell a story that happened there, or set a folk tale in the historic building when you're visiting that site. In the cafe over a cup of coffee. Lots of coffee shop stories. One story I tell, Johan the Magic Mouse, that takes place in a coffee shop. Stories from Tunisia. These are all on YouTube. But outdoor settings. Outdoors is such a wonderful place to tell stories. There's an interconnectedness with nature in so many traditional stories, like the silver birch, like the frog who wanted to fly. It's part of everyone's heritage. So if you are going outside, it's important to find a comfortable place where your students can stand or ideally sit, that's undisturbed. So that's sometimes a challenge if you're in a city, but maybe a park, for example. Find a location to suit the story. Telling a folktale in a natural environment gives students a sense of being connected between the imagined world of the story and the sensory experience in the parallel physical world, so they almost blend into one. I told that story, the silver birch, with some children, and afterwards the teacher was I was having a conversation with the teacher about the experience, and she was saying while we were sharing the story, the landscape of that piece of woodland near the school seemed more vibrant. There seemed to be an energy in the nature, and she said students were aware of the the shade given by the tree, and the coolness of the grass they were sitting on. And they were aware of the movement of the air. It was just a gentle breeze that day. And they could imagine that same tree at night, pulling its roots out of the ground and dancing. And they looked at the leaves that fell around the tree and how those might be the rewards and become those pieces of gold. And she said, every time my students sit under this tree or walk past this tree, they will remember the story of the silver birch. So storying our landscape, it's something deeply part of being human, and we can do that whether we're telling stories in mother tongue or target language. Details of the physical surroundings become intertwined with the world of the story and etched into the listener's memory. Imagine there's a tree near your school, and every time they walk past, children remember the English story that they learned there. And not only this, through storytelling outdoors in nature, we can connect students to nature, make them think about our connectedness. We can work towards a greener world. We can set up green projects. So many opportunities. Telling a story at Bystock Nature Reserve. This is a couple of years ago, before the pandemic. But it's just wonderful, the energy of nature. So Alida Gersi, who has a huge influence on me, Dr. Alida Gersi is a storyteller, and a pedagogue, and a drama therapist. And she talks about the power of storytelling to bring people together. And when learning creatively and collaboratively, students soon lose their inhibitions about trying out new ideas. They grow to enjoy themselves. Surprise and wonder, the richness of our inner worlds is often voiced. So we can ask students to talk about what they imagined, what they think the story reminds them of in their own lives and experience. Is there a story in your life where you've given something, like a dance for the tree, you've given something generously and have received a reward that was unexpected? Students might be invited to share personal stories. So this experience of sharing is, of course, in itself deeply satisfying, because so much of the work is focused around giving and receiving. And what happens when we do storytelling in our schools, in our classrooms, is initially it might be the teacher that's telling the stories. But soon, when students are learning those stories and retelling those stories, they will start to say, well, I've got a story that I'd like to tell. A story that my dad told me, or my granny told me, or a story that I read in a book. And we can invite them to come in and work on that story and send in a recording and then tell it in pairs and then work towards a performance. A process that I often work with is that I'll tell stories, teach a story, a simple story like The Frog and the Two Birds. Students retell it many times. And then they'll do another story and another story. One popular project in the UK is storytelling schools. A storyteller called Chris Smith, who was working with another man, Pi Corbett. They set up storytelling schools, and there are a number of storytelling schools where storytelling has become part of the school curriculum. Everything is learned through the medium of story in the school. Other subjects, even maths and science. And the children learn these stories. So every few weeks they change to a new story. But if you take a story like Goldilocks, they might learn a lot of different subjects through the medium of the story of Goldilocks. Obviously that's with primary. So then we're working towards children then, after having worked with stories over a period of months, even years, they start to bring in stories that they've chosen, that they want to share and perform. And it's hugely confidence building to be telling a story in one's own language, and even more amazing because I've encouraged many students at all levels of English, even at quite low levels of English, to be storytellers. And as they grow in confidence, it's remarkable how it trickles down into all aspects of their English learning. Particularly, I've worked with students who are working towards doing presentations, so young adults, and looking at the similarities between what makes a good story or a good telling of a story and a good, successful academic presentation. Essentially, it's the same skills involved. Alan Maley, who some of you may recognise. Oh, this is. I want to show you this slide as well of a storytelling festival in Nepal that started because a friend of mine, a teacher called Sika Gurung, started bringing storytelling to her students in Ulan school in Nepal, and then started an annual storytelling festival where the teenagers bring stories that they've learned from their families, and they come from diverse cultures and language groups within Nepal, and they bring stories that they've learned from their grandmothers, or for example, and retell them. Sometimes they tell them in their mother tongue, but more often they tell them in English, which is their language of education. But they're sharing their own culture through English and starting a storytelling festival. So it's going deeper. It's not just storytelling as part of the curriculum, but storytelling as a celebration of culture and identity. Alan Maley, who years ago was president of IATEFL, has written about creativity a great deal, and he wrote, "Over time, a learning community can come into being, where cooperation, sharing, and the valuing of others' contributions become a natural part of the way things are done." So not only in storytelling, but in looking at poetry and bringing in art and creative arts into language learning. The art becomes a medium for practicing English. I'm running a lot of storytelling courses, and also with my wife running teacher training and teaching online, and using a lot of creative approaches. So this is a course that I run, Creative and Engaging Storytelling for Teachers. And at the moment I'm running a course for Turkish teachers. Hello, if any of my Turkish teacher friends are out there. Some of you probably watching the recording. And this Saturday, so day after tomorrow, my next open course is beginning. And there's just a couple of places left. So if you act quickly, you could get onto the next course, which starts on the 13th of March and is happening on Saturday and Sunday through to the 28th of March. But if you can't do that one, there's another course, an intensive course starting on the 9th of April. So check it out if you're interested. I'm a member of the Creativity Group, Creativity for Language, for Change in Language Education, putting creativity at the heart of language learning. And I'm guessing if you're here in this meeting, in this webinar, you're interested in creativity. So why not explore the Creativity Group? Remember how important it is to bring creativity at all ages into our learning. And here are some sources to share. So that's my book, Storytelling with Our Students, which is all about developing as a classroom storyteller. Spontaneous speaking is also largely about storytelling, but personal storytelling. This story, Frog and the Two Birds, is published in English Teaching Professional magazine. I wrote a 21-part series called Student Stories, where each time I learned a story from a student from a different part of the world and shared activities to go with the story. And then there's some free British Council books which I've written chapters for, integrating global issues, and I wrote Storytelling for a Better World, and that's looking at storytelling and how through storytelling we can start to address global issues, thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, things like equality and justice and a greener world, fighting climate action. So that's a lovely way of getting into projects, particularly for teenagers and adults. And then creating an inclusive school environment is a chapter I wrote with Ala Gurksu last year. There's a webinar about that of that in the archive somewhere, isn't there, Paul? And then I mentioned the Hands Up project, Stories Alive, which is the book that Nick Bilborough wrote, which is a fantastic resource if you're working with younger learners and want to be looking at chants, for example, and pictures. And there's a photograph that I mentioned earlier, that gorgeous picture of the silver birch taken by Andreas Ravenmuller. And that's my website, my email address. As I said, I will answer your email if you send me a picture or a poem that you were inspired to create. And my YouTube channel, where you can find a lot of videos. I think there's hundreds of, maybe 300 or 400 different stories, me telling them in different contexts. So feel free to take a photo of that, and I will answer any questions that have come up in the course of the webinar.
I'm just putting a link into the webinar you mentioned there, the one that you did last year with Ala.
Okay.
So that's there. I found it.
And like I said, this is very much part 2 of 2 sessions. So if you missed the one that happened a couple of weeks ago about online storytelling, it's still a good webinar, I would say, to watch, even if you're not working online, because it's looking at some of the essentials of storytelling in teaching.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, no, I think there is a link to the first webinar you did. I'll just put it in the chat as well, so people have that. I realised that if you're watching this on a mobile and looking in the chat, a lot of these links aren't actually clickable, but the thank you email that you'll get tomorrow around about this time has most of those links in there. One thing, actually, David, someone was asking about the course you're running, the one this weekend. Someone said, how do I join? Is there a link?
I've got to. I'll just copy and paste into the chat now. I remember. Hang on a moment. I'll do that while you're
questions.
getting the next question ready, Paul. Here we go.
Great.
So those are the 2 courses that are coming up. So the first course there is starting this Saturday, and then there's another course starting on the 9th of April. But yeah, so act quickly. There are a couple of places left for this Saturday. So for the next 3 weekends.
Going fast. Okay, thanks, David. Again, I mean, obviously for the webinar a few weeks ago, and also for this one, part 2. And as you said, there's going to be, you're writing a couple of articles that will go with these webinars, also to complement these webinars, so there'll be a bit more. And as I said at the beginning, we've got a Facebook Live. You're everywhere. We're doing a Facebook Live with you next Tuesday.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that. So that's a really good opportunity to have to answer questions and discussion.
Exactly. So yeah, so if you do have any questions, do type them into the chat. If we don't get to them, then come along to the Facebook Live next Tuesday, and we'll try and answer them then. A couple of things. I mean, one of the things, actually, this isn't a question in the chat, in the Q&A, but it was a question I sort of had. I mean, I've taught young learners many years ago now, actually, to my shame, but I was sort of found with storytelling, I mean, the way you sort of did it, there's obviously a lot of energy, you know, you're a professional kind of storyteller. For teachers who perhaps don't have that, I don't know, what's the word, charisma, or they don't sort of feel comfortable maybe kind of showing the energy, what advice would you give to teachers who are watching this and thinking,
I'm really glad you asked that question. While you're answering that question, I realised that when I put the link to my courses, I didn't write it so everyone can see. So I'm just going to do that again now, because someone said, where's the link? So now it's there for all attendees.
Okay.
So the question you just asked, Paul, was what about people who don't feel so confident? I'm a professional storyteller. How do I do it? Will it work? And the answer is yes, it will work. And the reason it will work is because you are there in that room with your students, and they're getting to know you. They probably know you well already. And when you share a story with them, there will be a closeness and a trust that's built up. And it doesn't matter if you're not a very, I mean, I'm a very animated storyteller. I studied drama and did a lot of acting, but everyone has their own way of telling a story. And I think mimes and repetition are very useful techniques. They're not absolutely essential. I mean, we can tell a story in quite a quiet and still way and be totally engrossing as a storyteller. So everyone has their own way. And another thing I'd like to say is that if you make a mistake, if you forget part of a story, don't worry. You just go back and say, "Oh, I forgot to say," and and you can refer back and bring that bit of the story in. And your students won't be judging you; they'll be with you, because when you've put the book down and you're telling a story, they know that you've prepared this. They know that you're giving them something very special. It's a gift to tell a story, and they'll just be grateful for the fact that you're willing to reveal this aspect of yourself as a teacher. So once you start telling stories with your students, I think there's no looking back, really. I don't know. I haven't yet met a teacher who said, "Oh, I used to tell stories and then I stopped." I only hear the opposite. Oh, okay. I wish I'd started doing this earlier.
I liked. I mean, one thing that was very nice was you had the slides, and then you sort of you stop the slides, and you kind of bring in the realia, the ice cubes and everything. There's a really nice sort of shift in focus as well, which I think for students helps them, particularly with for both online and face to face. Where there's that shift. We're doing this now. We're doing this, rather than just kind of just sitting at a desk the whole time and
just a few simple props. They can just add so much. Just passing around that, just to feel that sheep's wool, texture.
Yeah,
it's amazing the power of the imagination. I've brought this with me actually today. You can see what it is, can't you, everybody? And you can, everybody knows what fruit this is. And orange. If you just, cut it, if you just cut it open, and I'm asking you now, as I hold this lemon in front of you, is anybody finding that they're starting to salivate? Because this is what happens when we think about or look at a lemon, and this is the power of sensory realia. Just by talking about something, or by showing you this wool, even though you're not holding, you can all imagine that texture. You can all feel it.
Yeah, it's kind of
And you know what hot, fresh baked bread smells like. I mean, I'm very, very lucky. My wife said, "Oh, could you bake one of your lovely rustic loaves, Tammy?" And it's just fresh. Oh, I'm so looking forward to tea time. Don't be jealous.
Sort of related to that, I suppose, with the realia, question from Aileen. Apologies for pronunciation if I pronounced that wrong. Around bringing in the realia into class and saying that every student's looking at you, what can you do so they don't see the realia before you show it? But maybe you kind of do want them to see it to raise that curiosity, perhaps.
Both ways. Sometimes I'll have everything on display. Sometimes I'll have everything in a bag. Today I'm going to tell you a story, and in the story there is wool, and there's a bell, and there's here's what part of a tree. Does anybody know what type of tree? It's a birch tree. So you're bringing these things out, and they're anticipating and getting ready. That's a wonderful way to go into a story. Or you can have them all hidden under a piece of fabric on the table, and then you pull the fabric back, and it's all revealed. And
what is it? Is it
students
game?
Love to handle the objects after the story has been told as well. The children all come up to the front, and not just the children, the students. They want to feel and listen and experience.
A question from Maria. Where can I find a criteria to select the right stories pitch books for young EFL learners? This is for pre-service EFL teachers. So I guess it's Maria. I guess you're a trainer, perhaps. So you're looking for some help to select.
Okay. Andrew Wright's book, Storytelling with Children. That's good for younger children. The resource I put in the resources page at the end, to Nick Bilborough's book, Stories Alive. That's very good with children starting out with English. Some of the stories in my book are also suitable for primary, when I wrote this book, I was mostly thinking about secondary and adults, but also there's I've written lots of resources for younger learners as well. For example, I didn't put it as a resource there, but the World Stories. If you look at World Stories, if you search for that on Google, I've written some stories for that, which is all about stories from different cultures again.
Sorry, Maria. I think I've just typed it in. So have I got this right? Andrew Wright, storytelling for children. Is that right?
Something like that. It's either storytelling with children or storytelling with children.
Okay. So hopefully you can find that, Maria. Through a Google search. Other browsers are available. Is it all right to have an age group of 7 to 12-year-olds in online classes from Said? I think a lot of 7 to 12-year-olds are in online classes. So, certainly something like storytelling, I would imagine, would be a great tool to use.
If anybody's interested, I co-host an event every Tuesday through the World Storytelling Cafe. And we have storytelling events nearly every day, but on Tuesdays I co-host, and we have young storytellers aged between 10 and 18 from all over the world who come into the cafe. They don't have to book in advance, they just turn up and they tell stories. And some kids come back every week. We've got a Jasname from Punjab. Hello, Jasname, if you're watching. And she comes and tells a story every week. She's a fantastic storyteller. And some kids just come to listen. It's like a story club. And it's safe, but if there's any concerns, children can come with a parent or with a teacher on Zoom. So just look up the World Storytelling Cafe. There it is. There's a link. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, I'll just put a link in there.
And then adults, there's for teachers, you can come on every second Sunday. There's a worldwide story round at 6 p.m.
Great. There we go. Join that.
And as I mentioned earlier, I'm hoping, if everything goes well, to be doing a project about museum artifacts and stories from around the world. So if anybody's interested in collaborating with me, then just drop me a line.
Right. And do you want to just put the slide up again? And I think you've closed them with the sort of contact details, because someone was also asking about your YouTube
absolutely.
channel. Is it just search for David Heathfield on YouTube? Would that get you?
Yes, yes. I'm all over you. Very easy to find, David Heathfield. And there's different. If you go to my YouTube homepage, or actually, I just put my name. If you find my channel, there are many different playlists. So, for example, storytelling with young learners of English, storytelling with teenage learners of English, storytelling with adult learners of English, storytelling with families, community events, storytelling outdoors, talking about. There's lots of interviews with me from different sources. So you can, if you're interested in exploring further. And then I've also got favourites, not just myself. I'm talking about myself all the time, but favourite storytelling videos. I've got a playlist of some other storytellers that I love listening to and recommend.
Right. So lots of stuff.
Lots to explore on my YouTube.
Absolutely. Just the last question is not related to attain the wooden percussion instrument that you were using. What's that called?
It's called an octo chime, because there are 8 pieces of wood, so it's the octo chime. So yes, it's a nice dramatic instrument.
Okay, David, if you're still here, then that's the answer. Okay, just to see if there are any more questions. Maybe people are keeping them and saving them up for next week's Facebook Live. But I think we've pretty much covered everything. There's a couple of comments. Someone, Despoina, saying that she told the story of the wise Ma Sabi to a live web meeting among narrators. So
fantastic. So that was the story I told last time at the last webinar, the Myanmar Burmese story. Yeah. What a beautiful story, and they loved it. So that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing the stories. This is what makes me happy. If you take one of these stories and share it with your students, that's delightful. And please do email me and share these experiences you've had.
Okay. Michael Faculty. Details for the Facebook Live. I'm just going to paste a link in to the Facebook Live. Again, obviously, apologies if you're on a mobile phone, because I don't think you can click that link. But as I said, you'll get a thank you email tomorrow, sort of 24 hours after this webinar. And in that thank you email, there's links to the Facebook Live, there's links to the certificates, there's links to the feedback survey. Please do fill that in, because obviously that helps us. It's great to sort of get your ideas and see what you think. There's also a link.
Thank you, by the way, to Michael Faculty for asking that question. Michael's a wonderful storyteller, so check out Michael Faculty. He's in the room with us now.
There you go. Hello, Michael. So yeah, as I say, there'll be links to all of that in the thank you email that you'll get tomorrow. I have been pasting the links to things into the chat, so if you haven't quite got those, then you can scroll up and get those links. Brilliant. David, I think we'll leave it there for now. I'll let you get some rest.
Thank you, all of you, for joining us today. There's lots of people in the room that I know well, and thank you very much for coming. But a big hello and big thanks for coming to all the people who are meeting me for the first time, and I hope to get to know you. Thanks very much, Paul, for having me for these 2 sessions. I'm looking forward to the Facebook Live.
Brilliant. Thank you. No, great. And we will see you on Tuesday. And just for anyone who's thinking of our webinars for next week or upcoming, we have, what do we have? Have a look. I did have it up on a page. We have, there it is, Picture Books in European Primary English Language Teaching. It's an organisation called PPELT, and it's a virtual resource for primary teachers. So if you're a primary teacher and you want more around using not so much stories but picture books, then
stories as well.
Stories as well, yeah. Then
that'll be a great session. People like Sandy Morrow on board. That's going to be wonderful.
Yep, exactly. So that's next Thursday, and that's at midday UK time, so a little bit earlier than this week. So have a look at that on the Teaching English website, and we'll hopefully see you then, and hopefully see you on Tuesday as well. So David, thanks a lot. And
thank you, Paul. Thanks for organising this.
Okay, see you soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks for joining us.